Hi everyone, welcome to or welcome back to my channel. So thank you for joining me today. But today I think it's time for a little change, and today is going to be that day. So today we're going to talk about our first unsolved South African true crime case. And I know last week we spoke about like a semi-unsolved case about Gert van Rooyen, and obviously if you haven't seen that, I will link it up here. Technically Gert was never tried or convicted, but at least we had a face to who was actually committing these crimes, apparently. But for this story, no one has officially been arrested, no one has officially been named. And sadly, like a lot of crime in South Africa, even though our cops do a great job most of the time, there are some instances where criminals get away with the crimes that they commit, and sometimes they fall through the cracks. And that time is this time. But without any more babbling from my side, let's get into this week's true crime story.
Intended for mature audiences only.
So this true crime story takes place in Pinetown, which is in South Africa, and there are some victims who managed to escape this mysterious serial killer, but there are also some who unfortunately did not. The first young woman who was face to face with the Riverside Strangler happened to take place on the 9th of August 1994. This young lady who was walking down Pastel Road in Pinetown, she was walking down a road that she had walked down plenty of times before, and down this road there's kind of like a lot of bushes and a lot of tall grass, and obviously, like I said, she's been down here so many times. So she's walking down the road and she's getting to this like bushy tall grass patch, and as this lady passes this patch, someone comes up from behind her, puts his hand over her mouth and drags her into the tall grass. And luckily, people were often walking up and down this road, so there were witnesses who heard her screaming and they came to her rescue. But before they could get to her, they can't just magically know where she is because she was hidden in a lot of bush and a lot of tall grass. While this lady was kicking and screaming, the person who grabbed her was now trying to sexually assault her and was hitting her, trying to get her to kind of shut up basically. And while all of this is happening, he's trying to hold her down. She's kicking and screaming. The witnesses are getting closer and closer because they can hear where she's screaming from. And he actually ended up stopping. He didn't do anything else to her and he ended up running away. And this lady, who sadly had to go through all of this, she did end up going to the police, and she did give a slight description of her attacker. So she described the man as very strong. He had torn clothes, had very dirty clothes on, and she also described him as a black male. Now for police, this was obviously a very difficult crime to try and solve because they only had her statement of what she said and what she witnessed, as well as the people who came to her rescue, but they didn't see the man who she was talking about, so it was only her word of what he looked like. But during that time, police didn't think that there were any other cases in 1994, and they believed that this was an isolated case. But unfortunately, 1995 had to roll on, and that was the year where a lot of devastation happened in Pinetown. On the 12th of February 1995, a young girl named Kim Boddington, who was around 13 at the time, she and her mom lived in a very small flat, and they were kind of going at it, they were fighting, they were screaming at each other, and Kim was like, "I've had enough." So she went out of the house and she was like, "I'm done with this." She just needed some time to cool off. So her mom stayed in the flat and Kim decided to go down to the river, which was right behind her flat. So she took a book and she was like, "I'm going to go read." And she went to sit down next to the tree, which was next to the river. And according to Kim's friends, she was described as tall. She had very long, dark brown hair, and she was very kind and very gentle. While Kim was busy sitting at the river reading, her mom was still in the flat, and she kind of left Kim there because she knew that they just had a fight, so she was waiting for them to cool off, and then she would just wait till Kim came home. But 5 o'clock rolled around and Kim was still not home. Kim's mom and dad had just gone through a divorce, so they lived separately. So when 5 o'clock rolled around and Kim was still not home, Kim's mom did end up calling her dad, and her dad came to the flat, and her mom and dad were just kind of brainstorming where she could be because Kim didn't really know the area very well. They had recently just got divorced, her parents, so they just moved in there. So Kim was kind of still feeling her way around her new area. Then on the 15th of February 1995, around 3 days after Kim had first gone missing, her dad was still out looking for her, but he then decided to look in the bushes just behind the flat where the river was. So he walked down to the bushes and sadly he saw Kim's body floating in the river. Kim had sadly been sexually assaulted and strangled, and crime scene investigators would later come to the crime, and they determined that Kim was sitting by the river reading her book when someone had come up from behind her and put their hand over her mouth so that she couldn't scream. because the neighbors who were right by the flat, they didn't report any noises or anything strange happening in the area. But Kim did fight back against her assailant, and she did have DNA under her fingernails. But back in the day, DNA was definitely not as advanced as it is now. So I don't think any DNA profile was taken. But according to crime scene investigators, Kim's shorts had been ripped off and she was sexually assaulted and then strangled and then dumped in the river. Kim's necklace, her book, and her shoes were missing. Then on the 17th of March 1995, and this was around 6 or 7 in the morning, a young lady was walking to work. And if you have ever walked to work, you would understand that you know exactly what's happening around you because you do this route almost every day. You know if something changes, you know roughly who's around your route because sometimes you see the same people every day. So like I said, this lady was walking to work and she saw this man like kind of walk across the street, and she's like, okay. What really made her stare at him is because he kind of ducked under a wall that was on her way to work. So as she's walking, she has to pass this wall to get to work, and she walks past it and this man grabs her and tries to drag her and towards the river. But luckily she had a taser on her, and she took the taser and luckily she got some skin, and the guy let go for like a second or two and then grabbed her again, so not very long. And unfortunately she was dragged quite far towards the river by then, but somehow she managed to get his hand off of her mouth and she started screaming. And luckily there were some builders who were quite close by and they came to her rescue. And this guy must have not noticed him for quite a while because the builders were roughly about 5 meters away from him when he actually noticed them. So obviously these builders are coming closer and the attacker eventually notices them. So he lets her go and he runs away. Some of the builders did give chase to him, but they eventually just stopped and went back to the lady to make sure that she was okay. And all of the builders plus the woman did end up going to the police, luckily. So the builders and the woman who was attacked all had the same description of the man because they were all close enough to see him. They all described him as a black male who had dreadlocks, as well as very, very torn and dirty clothes. And the attack was reported to Pinetown Murder and Robbery Satellite Unit. And because the lady who was attacked in 1994 in the tall grass and bushes described a very similar looking man, the police here now took the attack in 95 and 94 and put 2 and 2 together. Not only were the descriptions from the two ladies very similar in what the man looked like, but the modus operandi was also very, very similar. For instance, he would lurk, especially near tall grass and the river, and then he would try and surprise the woman through bushes, tall grass, or hiding behind something. Now, this next bit of story is very frustrating to me, especially when I read it, because I guess you can't judge what someone would have done because you're not in that situation. On the 27th of March 1995, a young girl named Kate Willy was walking back from school like she does every day with a group of her friends. And basically she was walking back to school, there was a group, and every time you get close to a street, one friend would kind of branch off and you would eventually get less and less people in your group. But around 3 o'clock on the 27th of March, a lady was driving down the road and kind of near the embankment of the river, and she noticed a young girl being dragged into the bushes near the embankment. And this lady didn't get out of the car. She left the girl and drove home and then called the police. And I understand that there were no cell phones back in the day, so she had to go home and call the police. But it's just so frustrating because by the time the police actually got to the embankment where this lady claimed the attack was happening, unfortunately, Kate Willy had been murdered. And some witnesses even said that a lot of people saw Kate Willy being dragged into the bushes near the embankment. However, no one stopped to help and no one actually pulled this man off of her. And it sounds just like the case that we did earlier this year about Kitty Genovese. And if you haven't seen that, I'll link it up here. But it's kind of like the bystander effect, and it's just very frustrating because she was so young. Like I said, you can't judge if we're not in that situation. But anyway, so sadly police got there, and like I said, Kate had unfortunately been strangled to death, and she had also been sexually assaulted. And police said that she had fought violently against her attacker, and police then put a lookout for a man who had very severe scratching on his face, because they said that the way that Kate had fought against her attacker, he would have very deep scratches on his face. It sucks to have to end the story on such a frustrating note, but that is the only known victims that were associated with the Riverside Strangler. And I think personally, serial killers don't stop killing. I think that if something triggers them, then they're going to act on what they feel they need to do inside. And maybe in Pinetown, those specific murders stopped because maybe the Riverside Strangler had been murdered himself. However, there were some reports that there was a similar MO of those type of murders happening in Pietermaritzburg. So maybe the Riverside Strangler had actually moved over to Pietermaritzburg, because they did actually find this man who was killing in Pietermaritzburg, and they said that he was not fit to stand trial, so he was taken to a psychiatric hospital. So I'm not sure if maybe that's why the Pinetown murders stopped, but they did. Also, when you hear about the modus operandi of the Riverside Strangler and you hear that he was lurking and that he was specifically targeting women, I wonder if he actually stalked his victims, or if he was just an opportunist and he just saw a young woman walking by herself, or if he actually knew the victims before he attacked them. So we will never know if the Riverside Strangler was ever actually caught or ever stopped for anything that he was doing, or if he's actually still lurking and he's still stalking women in Pinetown. And that's what I'm going to leave you with, that thought for the day. But let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you were entertained by the story. Let me know down below if you maybe prefer the unsolved true crime stories, or if you prefer just solved crimes. Because like I said before, I definitely like closure, but I thought this was quite interesting. But that's it from me. I hope you have a great day further, and I hope that you are staying safe. Thank you for joining me here again, and I'll see you next week. Bye.